Friends, welcome back to another Pints with Jack Skype session. This is your friend Matt here. And as always, I am joined by my dear friend, co-host, the brain, David Bates. David, welcome.
Thank you, Matt.
And as always, this is where we talk about something in very specific from the chapter. And we try to make it more personal. We try to go deep into it. And we are in the last couple chapters of Till We Have Faces. So this has been, 24 chapters? Do math real quick, Matt. This has been 6 months in the building to this content here.
Yeah, we also haven't been doing them an episode.
Yes, you're right.
We also haven't been doing them a chapter.
They've been about 2 for a lot of them. So this is about 3 months to building, and we've only got this and one other chapter left. So what that means is truth and wisdom that Lewis has been trying to communicate and building to is coming out. And it came out in a big way today. And usually I like to open it up, David, and ask you what stuck out to you. And I probably should, but I really want us to go down a certain path. And what stuck out to me was we've been talking so much, and particularly on these Skype sessions is where we talk about it more in depth, is that false self, true self. And we've talked about that false self in a way that can sometimes come across as false self bad, true self good. Except that's not the case. In a recent blog post I did also discuss that using the Jean Valjean character, and it's somewhat my fault for making it seem that way. It's more the false self can be filled with some good and bad, but either way we need to unpeel it to get to that true self. And Orwell has been on this journey of building that up, and now she's in the last couple of chapters starting to unwind that. In the previous 2 chapters, we see her. There's this process where she's rewriting her story. She's writing her story, where she's sifting through memories, and she's realizing she remembered them incorrectly, and she's realizing that the narrative that she's had in her head is wrong for different reasons. From Bardia's wife, and then Ansett. Bardia's wife is Ansett, right? Yes, and then Taryn. That's the other one. So there's been a couple scenes.
Yeah, who Taryn told her about, read about.
Yes. So there's been a few key scenes where she's essentially learned that the narrative in her head is wrong. This false self that she's built up is wrong. So long story short, we get to this chapter here, and she's getting ready to build this case for the gods. And the case was supposed to be the entire first book. But then she gets to the gods, and it's just this small little shabby book left. Which to me, you asked me what I think that signified. I thought that signified that she's worked through in the other chapters a lot of her other false self. But there's still this last part that's left. This deepest part. She's unpacked the layers to get to this core part of who she is. And that's what she ends up reading to the gods. And there's a sentence that I want to read here. Not even a sentence. It's like a half sentence. But she says, as she's in front of the judge, against her will, she says, I heard myself reading it. And you made a comment that those are very charged words. Against her will, I heard myself reading it. Almost suggesting that she's been reading it to herself her whole life, or at least for quite some time. But she hasn't been able to hear it. And to me, that suggested the layers that she's built of defense against this core part of herself that's, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, this core part of herself that we're about to unpack here, she can now hear because she did the work of the other layers of herself. She unpeeled the onion, if you want to call it that. And that really stuck out to me. And I could continue going on, but then I'm just going to end up doing everything without any of your input. So I'm going to stop briefly, let you give some input, and then we can keep going further in this because you already know the direction I'm going with this now.
Well, I think it's very telling that she has this vision, firstly of the desert, and then ultimately coming into this cavern inside the mountain where she presents her case. All of this is kicked off when she says that she's going to go and find her one true solace. She seems very detached from everything that's going on. She's going to take her book that she has written, and she's going to go and reread it and comfort herself with how much and how truly she loves Psyche. And it's when she opens the book that then this vision begins, and she ultimately finds that, first of all, she's holding this empty bowl, and then this empty bowl ultimately becomes this little scrappy little old gnarled little book that looks like it's got the rantings of a crazy person, that this has been the thing that's been underneath all of that. While she's been nourishing herself with the story that she's been telling herself about how much she loves Psyche, how she did everything for her, how she even wounded herself for Psyche.
Yes.
That really what was underneath all of it was this little scrap of paper where she's complaining against the gods.
And she finishes that with the sentence, there was given to me a certainty. So this is after, by the way, she's gone through that. She's read that scrappy book, which is essentially that core part of herself, her core complaint to the judges. She says, there was given to me a certainty that this at last was my real voice. I asked you this on the podcast, but I want us to talk about it a bit here. That real voice, I think of that as that true self. And like I said before, that's not always a beautiful thing. True self doesn't mean, well, it does mean authentic, but it doesn't mean pure, good, and beautiful. It can be the ugly and the broken. So I'm curious your thoughts, what you would say that real voice is, that true self, and maybe in general, but then in the context of Orwell.
I would say it's truly her. Stripped away, in the story, she herself has been stripped. Her veil has been taken away. She's even been stripped of her clothes. She hasn't time to read this thing butt naked. Mm-hmm. And this is her true voice insofar as stripped away are all of the pretensions, all of the self-delusion. It is her true self. It is the unvarnished Orwell. She's not presenting a front either to impress other people or to try and protect herself. This is how she truly feels.
And what is unvarnished Orwell? Just kind of curious your thoughts after reading the book.
Deeply jealous.
Deeply jealous.
Deeply jealous. Her complaint against the gods is that the gods have been beautiful and they have not taken Psyche away. They have wooed her away from Orwell. And as she says again and again, Psyche is mine.
Mm-hmm. She says it 5 times in 2 sentences, pretty much. And we've learned that she's the shadow brute. She's Ungish. She's the devouring love. That's like you said, jealous, possessive. So,
and when she kept saying mine, 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 I naturally thought of the Great Divorce, and also the response that Reginald gives to Pam when Pam says that her son is mine. Reginald says, how yours? You didn't make him. Nature made him grow in your body without your will. And then he mentions even against your will. He was an accident. But that question, when you say something is mine, how yours?
So we've now gotten to this part of this true, authentic self. And we have just discussed how it's not always pretty. What does this mean for our spiritual journeys? We're supposed to do what Orwell did. We're supposed to unpack this false self in this life, attempt to, through God's grace. God's grace is guiding it constantly. It's the fuel that we need to do it. But then there's also doing that own self-work, self-awareness. For some people, it can be psychotherapy. I mean, there's different ways to unpack that false self. But you get to this core of who you are. You get to where Orwell is right now. And maybe Lewis will answer this in the next chapter. But what are we to make of this? As you and I, as listeners as well, okay, Matt and David, I get it. Get to my core self. That means the broken. That means the needy. That also means some good stuff too. But this who I am and my desires at the core of it. So now what? Because she recognizes it kind of sucks. Her true self is terrible. Does that mean I just get to then have these needy, terrible, devouring desires and then all's good and I'm going to get to heaven with that?
I think it begins by just at least acknowledging them. And that's what she hasn't done up until now. We've spoken in previous episodes about the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Basically, blessed are those who declare spiritual bankruptcy, that declare their dependence upon God. And you can only do that when you're truly honest with yourself and take a good, hard look at your life and realize your utter dependency upon God. And that will lead to this despair, but it should, if it's correctly responded to, then result in you throwing yourself at the mercy of God and asking for his grace. Orwell even says that in this chapter when she tries very hard to be good, to become beautiful of soul. She realizes that she can't actually do this without divine help. And that was exactly what Lewis said in Mere Christianity. He said, only a man who's tried to be good realizes how bad he really is. And when we make that experiment, when we give that a try, we realize that we need help. And it's unsurprising that that chapter of Mere Christianity is called Faith, because the correct response to recognizing our situation is to throw ourselves on the mercy of Christ.
And I'm going to connect this a bit to my own journey and story briefly. If you want to hear all of it, you can go listen to that episode that we did. Was it episode 18 or 19 or something in season 3, right around there. This was that point in San Diego, about 12 months into San Diego, when I was at Adoration. And I had built that whole false self up over, well, more or less high school, college, and just slightly after college. So good 6 to 8 years of building it up, putting my identity and worth and accomplishments, but not recognizing it, but somewhat recognizing it, and then getting to a point on my knees in adoration that I surrender to you, God, and then going to confession, breaking down and saying, like, I've put my entire identity in this. And that was just the beginning, which I think is what we've been talking about here. The beginning is the process of the self-awareness, but then once you do all of that, it's like then the real journey begins. And that's the finding your real self. And that's the self that you can only find, as Lewis says, in Christ. And you can't go to him for it. You have to just go to him, but he gives it to you. And I like how you keep using by asking for Christ's mercy. In my own journey, it was this point that I recognized that no longer was it an intellectual exercise. No longer was it a will it exercise, which is what Orwell already tried to do in this chapter.
And failed.
It became a surrender and an openness to receiving the divine love. And ultimately what you and I have talked about a ton, theosis, I believe at least. I'm somewhat connecting those to this, but I believe that once you do that and you say, Christ, I want you to form within me. And you do whatever that looks like, depending on your denomination or your faith backgrounds. In our case, in the Catholic faith, for me, that was going to daily mass. For me, that was a rosary. For me, that was adoration. For me, these were the mechanisms that I brought in Christ's mercy, in his divine life, the sacraments particularly, which was the big revelation to me. That the definition is a transmission of the divine life. There's more to the definition. That changed everything for me. But it began hitting the bottom. It began with my hands in the air on adoration. It began with my eyes crying in front of a priest. It began with some tissues that when I went into confession and saw them, I said, who needs those? Well, me. And then that began a journey.
And hopefully we'll see that in Orwell in the next chapter.
Yes.
Which is the last chapter, so it had better happen, otherwise I'm going to be very annoyed.
I have high expectations for the truth that is going to be revealed in that chapter, and I hope some of the stuff that you and I are speculating right now, because I feel like we've hit where Orwell's at the bottom. She's accepted all this, and now she needs to start this reascent. I'm hoping Lewis gives us clarity on what he believes that ascent looks like.
It must be great to be able to read a book, completely forget about what happened, and then experience it anew again.
Yes, that's exactly what I do.
Imagine how much you could save on movie rentals. You only need to rent 5 movies, just have them in a cycle.
Because this is my 3rd time reading this book now, and I don't remember it at all.
Well, hopefully it'll leave a little bit more of a memory this time.
Well, on that note, with some humor, thank you again, David, for your wisdom. Although this time I think I did a big amount of monologuing, but that's okay.
Beautiful.
Until next week, my friends, cheers.
Cheers.